All right, I'm going to start. Okay, so yesterday what we did is we talked about population dynamics. Right, so what are the interesting things that can happen as a result of some sort of interactions within a population? We talked about competition for resources, as well as if you have cooperative growth, you can have things like bistability, a minimal viable density required for survival, as well as tipping points leading to collapse of populations and deteriorating environments. All right, so that was really focused on this quantity n, population size. All right, so today what we're going to do is we're instead going to think about population size as being fixed throughout most of the day today. Instead, we're just going to think about fractions f. All right, so what are the interesting things that can happen when you have different subtypes within a population? All right, so today we're going to talk about evolutionary game theory in general, and in particular this idea that there's no assumption of rationality that's required. Then we'll talk about the evolution of cooperation as kind of a canonical example of applying some of these ideas of evolutionary game theory to try to understand the dynamics of biological populations in general, but then microbial populations in particular. And so since we're starting with a lecture on games, I thought that we would start with a game. All right, so this game is called, well, it's not a very creative name, but it's called Guess 2/3 of the Average Game. The nice thing about the name of the game is that it kind of tells you the goal of the game. All right, what we're going to do is have you get in groups of 3 or 4. All right, then what I want you to do is to spend 30 seconds, scope out your enemy, right? Look at the, your opponents and try to figure out what they're gonna guess. All right, and after 30 seconds, what you're gonna do is you're gonna write down a number between 0 and 100. All right, inclusive, could be fraction. I recommend maybe go ahead and do an integer just for ease of calculation. All right, but you're gonna write this privately, and then you will reveal your number to your opponents. You calculate the mean, or average, or whatever. Calculate the mean, and then the winner is the person whose number is closest to 2/3 of the mean within your group. Okay? So the person's closest. But closest to 2/3 of the mean. All right, so do you guys understand what's going to happen? All right, you're going to get in groups of 3 or 4. Think about what you want to do. You're going to write down a number secretly, reveal it. Your goal is to be closest to 2/3 of the mean of the numbers that are reported within the group. Okay, so start so we don't want to use up too much time. All right, so you should be at the stage of revealing your numbers and starting to do the calculation about now. Yeah. No, each individual should have their own number, and you reveal the number simultaneously to the other individuals in the group, and then you do the calculation. So you should have, yeah, so each person has a number, right? All right. All right, you should be figuring out the winners of your groups here. All right, do you need more time to figure out who won? All right. You can use, you're allowed to use your iPhone to do the calculations if it helps. So, all right, we're going to go ahead and start reconvening. If you're in the last stages of figuring things out, that's okay. All right, so the winners in each group, raise your hand and you get the acclaim of your peers. Okay, very good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around, I'm going to point to you, and I want you to yell out what number it was that you bid. Okay, Sid? 10. All right, so we have a 10 as a winning bid. 17. 23. 18. Okay. 15. 19. 13. Okay. 30. Oh, sorry. Okay. 11. 21. 5. Oh, interesting. All right, we got a low bit. 5. 50. 53. Okay, wow, that's all right, 53. Okay, is that it? Okay, all right, one more. 39, okay. Indeed, yeah, so this is the problem that, you can go out and you can go onto the internet, get many groups, and you can get statistics, and I think that kind of mid-20s is a typical winning bid in this game. All right, now the question is, what's the right way to think about this, and how could this sort of reasoning possibly be applicable to any sort of biological population? Do it, right? Yeah. So indeed, doing it again is actually would actually be useful, but it maybe takes too much time. Yeah, that's right. But I think that's pointing to something that's very relevant in all of this, which is. How is it that this sort of process, how could it possibly map to biological populations, or just even within a population like this, how is it that if you did this over and over again, how is it that the bids would change? Okay. All right, so first of all, in some ways, the solution of the game is to bid 0. Okay, and how many people bid 0? Okay, right. So only one. And what's interesting is that, of course, the person that bid 0, which is in principle the solution of the game, didn't win, right? And then you say, okay, well, and he can of course say, oh, it's because it's the fault of my opponents. They didn't, But then you kind of say, well, does that make sense? Okay. All right. So yeah. So what's going on here? All right. In the context of this sort of game, we're all involved in a bunch of rational thinking, right? So we kind of consider, all right, well, what should the solution maybe be? Or maybe other people won't do that, so then maybe I should do something else, right? So clearly, we don't believe that that sort of reasoning is going to be what hedgehogs are doing, and definitely it's not what microbial populations are doing. Right? So certainly, if you have to apply this sort of extreme rational thinking in order to apply any of these sorts of ideas to biological populations, then we're in trouble. Okay? So the question is, all right, well, how is it that things could possibly work, right? Now, in the context of evolutionary game theory, what we do is we assume we go from the payouts. So let's say that this is a game where each winner gets $5. Okay, not true, but you can imagine. Okay, right. So the payouts from the game, instead, we translate that into fitness, meaning that if you perform better in the game, then you somehow have a higher reproductive fitness. Right. So everyone that raised their hands, everyone was impressed with them. Right, and then that could translate into something, increase in marriageability or something. Okay, all right. So the idea is that you replace the payouts from the game to some sort of reproductive fitness. Then you also have mutations that will sample different strategies. And then what you have is differences in fitness leading to evolution towards the solution of the game. Okay? So delta fitness, right? Evolution to the solution. Okay. So one thing that you could think about in this game is if we only allowed the winners in each of their groups to reproduce, have children but with mutations. Right, so the idea is that their bid could be heritable, right? Genetically heritable. Right? So Sid, his genetics tell him to bid 10. Right? He has children, and it's going to be around 10, but some of them are going to be 5, some 10, some 15. Right? So mutation leads to different strategies. And then you have the children, the next generation, compete in this game. They play this game. And then again, winners have children, mutation, and what you'll see is that you'll go to lower and lower bids, and eventually the population will evolve to 0. Right? Or in the context of human decision making, we could play the game again, right? And then through a process of learning, you'll also then evolve to 0. But the key thing here is that we could think about this from the standpoint of humans engaged in rational decision-making, or we could just imagine that they're genetically encoded strategies that lead to differences in fitness as a result of the interactions within the population. Question at this stage? Yes?
Solution 0 at this point of time. Anybody who mutates to 1 will win.
Okay, so the question is, let's say that you have a group of 4 individuals, say, that are bidding 0, 0, 0, 0. All right. Okay. Well, right now. Okay. Now you want to ask. Okay. So now I'm trying to explain the idea of this Nash equilibrium. All right. So my claim is that this is a solution of the game. Right. And by solution here, what I'm referring to is this Nash equilibrium, where the claim is that this is the set of strategies such that no individual would have the incentive to unilaterally change the strategy. Okay? Right? And this is no incentive for unilateral change. Unilateral means that I change and everyone else stays what they are. Okay? No incentive for unilateral change. All right, and you're proposing that perhaps this is not a Nash equilibrium, that one of the individuals should have the incentive to go to bid 1. Right? So let's ask, is this a Nash equilibrium? All right, so here we'll ask, what happens if these 3 remain at 0, and I ask, okay, the 4th individual, do they have the incentive to unilaterally change their strategy to 1 or to anything else? For a Nash equilibrium, you have to ask for any other strategy. Okay, so now we can do our calculation. We get the mean. All right, so the mean is a quarter. Right, and 2/3 of the mean is even lower, but the zeros are still closer to 2/3 of the mean. Right. So what you see is that if all the individuals in the group are bidding 0, then then that actually is a Nash equilibrium. No individual would have the incentive to change the strategy. So I'll just say here, this is a Nash equilibrium. There was another question. Yes.
So is this like a rational strategy that, I mean, the Nash equilibrium, does it come from a rational argument, or like, is it like, I mean...
Well, okay, so Nash, he proposed it in the context of human decision-making, where there is a rational basis in the sense that you might think, oh, well, what should I do such that it's an equilibrium concept because once you're in this state, then nobody would want to change what they're doing, right? Whereas if you were not in a Nash equilibrium, then that means there exists some individual that wants to do something different. That means they would, but then things are going to start changing, and so you could imagine it as being there's going to be some sort of dynamics until you get to this equilibrium. Or the argument in game theory might be that you should just already bid the Nash equilibrium because that's kind of what you should do. Of course, on the other hand, in practice with individuals playing a real game, they don't. It's not that we had 4 individuals bidding 0, right? And I think you can really make the case that in many situations, the application of game theory to biological evolution is actually on more solid footing than for human decision making, because you have the natural process of evolution that will lead to the solution of the game. So you don't need to worry about whether the individuals are rational or not. You just get the evolutionary dynamics to the solution. Okay, so I think that this is just a way to start framing the debate. All right, now what we want to do is think about this phenomenon of frequency-dependent selection, just because this is maybe an alternative way of thinking about many of the dynamics we're going to be talking about. And like always, it's good to think about a given phenomenon using different perspectives. Okay. Right, so this is frequency-dependent selection, which is something that Paul was talking about. Actually, both Pauls, frankly. Right. But this morning we were hearing about this thing about the mutators, and there was the mutator genotype had apparent frequency-dependent selection, that it would win or not depending on its initial frequency. And I think that the conclusion from that was that it was not actually frequency-dependent, but rather that the probability of the genotype winning was somehow proportional to its initial abundance in the population, because that would lead to it being more likely to get that mutation. So it's something that looks like frequency-dependent selection, but it's not, so that's dangerous. So, right, so I think when we hear what we're talking about frequency-dependent selection, we're really thinking about a situation where, from the deterministic fitness perspective, there's a difference in the fitness. Okay? So what I'm plotting here is, say, the fraction of some type A, and here I'm going to look at the growth rate of A minus the growth rate of B, which is the rest of the population. Here it's going to be 0. Now, these are growth rates. Now, if we had frequency-independent selection, that's what we think about as the normal kind of situation of just maybe one type is more fit than another. We might have something that looks like this. This is frequency-independent, because the difference in the fitness does not depend upon the frequency of that mutant in the population. Right? So this is fraction of A going from 0 to 1, difference in the growth rate. And what you see is here, A is just a more fit genotype. Right? So it's just a beneficial mutant. Okay. So in that case, A will grow in frequency over time. Okay. However, there are many, many situations in which you get frequency-dependent selection, meaning that this line is not horizontal, but has some other behavior. And there are, I'd say, two qualitatively interesting forms of frequency-dependent selection. One of them is where it looks like this. This is what we call negative frequency-dependent selection. And it's negative because the slope is negative, meaning that as the genotype A frequency gets larger, its relative fitness, as compared to B, is decreasing. Okay? And what you see is here it's crossing this 0 line, which means that if A is very frequent, then it's less fit, so its frequency goes down. However, if the frequency of A is small, then it's more fit than B. The growth rate of A is larger than the growth rate of B, so its frequency will grow. Now, what you see is that you get stable coexistence of these two types in the population at equilibrium. Okay? Now, this is negative frequency dependence. I want to just make a note that here this gives you coexistence, whereas if we had a curve that would look like this, in some sense, this does have it's still negative frequency dependent in the sense that as your frequency grows, you become less fit. But what you see is here that this does not cross the equal fitness line, so this does not lead to coexistence. So this one here is no coexistence. And there's a bit of, I would say, just nomenclature issue in the field where normally if someone says negative frequency dependent selection, what they're referring to is a situation where this is coming down and it crosses this line. So you get, which leads to coexistence. Okay. And the other kind of qualitatively interesting thing that can happen is if you have something that's more, say, positive frequency-dependent selection. Right, so it looks somehow like this. Now, the more abundant you are in the population, the more fit you are. This is, again, gamma A minus gamma B. Right? What you see is that this leads to bistability. Right? Because if A is more abundant, it has higher fitness. It's crossing the x-axis, so this actually leads here to bistability. Okay. Interestingly, one of the early examples of this, a natural example you might think of is in the context of if you had two armies fighting, then whichever army starts out being bigger is going to be the one that's maybe going to win. Right, so this sort of antagonistic interaction is one that will maybe naturally lead to something like bistability. And there was another paper, so Lin Chow comes up a lot, very creative guy. And similarly, it was maybe around 1980 that he wrote a paper looking at toxin production in E. coli and found that there was some, in well-mixed populations, there was some sort of bistability in this. In that case, it was between a producer and a non-producer, but I think the key thing is that this can naturally arise due to toxin production. Okay. And that's just if you imagine two types that are each inhibiting each other, for example, that would naturally lead to something like bistability. Whereas this negative frequency-dependent selection is something that is often observed in cases where you have some sort of cooperative behavior. You have what you'd like to say is a cooperator that is benefiting a defector, but then the defector is harming, say, the cooperator, just by resource competition. Right? So this often leads to negative frequency-dependent selection and often leads to coexistence as well. All right, so this is, if you'd like, this is applying some sort of rough ideas from evolutionary game theory in the sense of just highlighting that, the fitness of different types can depend upon the frequency, but maybe the language or the way of thinking about it is a bit closer to the traditional view of population genetics because it's really thinking about this phenomenon of negative frequency dependent selection is, of course, has been known for many years that it can happen. And it's not applying so much of this machinery of game theory. And what you find is that different communities of people like to look at the same phenomena in very different ways. And I would say I'm a fan of looking at things in different ways, so that's fine. We often do use, for example, the language of cooperator defection because it does sometimes, it's, I think, easier to think about things, but it also can be dangerous because it makes you, it can make you assume the results of experiments before you actually do them. So that's I think, the counterpoint. Yes? All right. So the question is whether you can have oscillations, right? And if you are thinking about it only in terms of an F, then again, it's not going to be possible. But I'll show actually some data at the end of today where we observe spirals between cooperators and defectors. So they're not limit cycle oscillations, but they are, they're oscillatory in some sense. Yeah. All right, so the question is whether this one is analogous to evolving different, or sorry, to co-evolving, which one now? Oh, different homologous, okay, so co-evolving different amino acids in homologous sequences. Okay, but you can have, you're thinking about when two proteins there's a binding interface, and then they're co-evolving, is that? Okay, so I think it's an interesting. I'm not. I think it would take some time to figure out if there's a mapping there or not. Yeah. Okay. We will talk about some of the this view from the standpoint of game theory, just because I think that it's also an interesting way to look at things. But before we do that, I want an example of part of what I think is the power of using some of this language, like cooperation and defection. And then, of course, there's also the flip side, which is why it might be dangerous. But I think that I think it's a little bit maybe. All right, I'm gonna give a problem that we're gonna do, and then I'm gonna explain later why it is relevant for this question of what language we use to think about a problem. Okay? So this is what's known as the four-card problem. It's a famous problem from psychology, and I want to make sure I get it correct. Okay? Yes? All right, so you're wondering, in one of these two cases? Okay, so, all right, so I think there are a couple things to say. One is, okay, so and this comes back to what Paul was talking about this morning, and that if any initial mutant in the population is going to be present initially at low frequency. So then it's very important and interesting to ask, what is going to be the relative fitness of a mutant when it's rare? Right? And one thing that you see is that these two situations are quite different in that regard. Right? So here, a rare mutant is initially selected for. It will often be subject to stochastic extinction. We're not going to talk about that today, but the statement there is just that even a beneficial mutation is typically lost due to stochastic effects, but at least if it survives stochastic effects, it'll spread and then reach coexistence. Whereas what you see here is that an initial mutant will be selected against. Right? So that means that it's actually quite difficult to go from this state to this state. Right? But then, so then there are a lot of discussions about how that might happen. One thing that's observed in Lin Chao's original paper was that if you did the experiments in spatially structured environments, then it was no longer quite like this, and that the toxin producer could now actually spread. Right, so what he had found is that in well-mixed conditions, the toxin producer couldn't spread because they just weren't making enough toxin to harm the population, yet they were paying the cost. Whereas in in spatially structured environments, then they could actually locally kill their competitors and then spread. Right, so then that highlights that you often have to think about the difference between well-mixed and spatial environments. I may not have answered your question, though. Sorry. Yeah, I don't know if I would say that there's a general way. Well, yeah, but a predator-prey interaction is essentially like this, if you'd like to think about it in that way. Yeah, so maybe we should chat about it afterwards. 'Cause I don't. Yeah, but it maybe. But here, though, maybe the key thing I would like to just point out is that it's often assumed that mutations are interacting in a frequency-independent way. And if you know that that's the case, that means that you can just start at 50-50 and do a competition. And if the fraction goes up, then it's more fit, right? So if you just measure fraction as a function of time, you start here. If you see it going up, then you say, oh, it's more fit, right? But if they're frequency dependent, then you have to be careful, right? Because if you start up here, you might see it come down. Okay. So if you think that there's a reason to believe that something might be frequency dependent, then it's very important to start at different frequencies and then look to see what happens. One of my pet peeves is that even in situations where we know that there's frequency dependence, like people are studying cooperation cheating, often they just mix it 50-50 and then they, and that. So, all right. Okay, so I want to do this four card task because it's fun. All right, so you're given 4 playing cards, and they're face down on a table, and this is what you see. The question is, which cards are you going to have to flip over in order to, all right, question is which to flip. And you want to know if the following statement is false. To determine if false. Okay. There's a question mark maybe here. All right, here's the statement. If a card has a vowel, has on one side, then it has an even number on the other. All right, so you're told, okay, first that all these cards, they have a letter on one side and a number on the other. Okay? Now, someone says, oh, if a card has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other. And the question is, which card or cards do you have to flip over in order to check or to test this proposition? How many numbers? The numbers could be anything, the letters could be anything. Yeah, all that you know is that each card on one side has a letter and the other side has a number. Okay? And you want to test that proposition. Wait, no, don't say anything. No talking. All right. Okay, so we're going to vote, and then we're going to discuss. All right, and be careful. All right, so you're going to vote by putting up 1 or 2 hands with which cards you want to flip over. You guys understand? So if I wanted to flip over A and D, I would do 1 and 2. Okay, but no talking for now. All right, and I think it's good to just spend. We don't want to rush. We're on vacation. Some of us are on vacation, so let's spend a little bit of time to think about it. Okay? And we'll vote in 30 seconds. You can flip over as many as you want, but then you have to take off your shoes and put up your feet. All right, do you need more time? All right, we're going to vote. You can put up 1, 2, 3, or 4 appendages. Okay, ready? 3, 2, 1. All right, so we have a fair number of different... Some people are not voting, though. The pressure is... all right, so I would say that there's quite a few different answers out there. So go ahead, turn to a neighbor and discuss. Yeah. So we want to know which cards we have to flip over in order to test that statement. To test the statement, if a card has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other. Okay, let's go ahead and reconvene. Okay, all right. So we want to know. Okay, if a card has a vowel on one side, then it has an even number on the other. Okay. All right. So we can walk through. It's an if vowel then even, right? All right. So if this proposition is true, what can we say about this card? Then it should have an even number on the other side, right? And to test that, we have to flip it over, right? So we're definitely going to have to flip this. That's good. All right. What about this card? We actually don't care what's on the other side on that card, right? So doesn't matter. This one is one that causes a lot of problems, right? All right. If vowel, then even. Yeah, but actually, it doesn't say, it could be a consonant on here, and that would be okay too, right? All right, so this is the one that I think causes a lot of problems. So here again, we actually don't care what's on the other side of this card. Okay, but then here, what does it matter on this one? Okay, all right, so if this proposition is true, what should this card be on the other side? It should be what? Not a vowel. Okay, right, because here, if it's a vowel, then even. Okay. Now here, this is not even, so this is the one that causes a lot of problems, right? Because if we flip this over and it's a vowel, then there's a problem, right? So this is one we also have to flip over in order to test this hypothesis. And of course, even if we flip these over and it's consistent with the statement, it doesn't prove the statement's correct, but these are the two that we would have to flip over to have the possibility of disproving the statement. Okay? All right, so this is a very famous problem because it's hard. Right? Very small fraction of college students actually get this correct, right? So this is demonstrably hard. Okay? Now, I want to give you the same problem, the same logical problem, in terms that are human, where the reasoning is trivial. Okay? All right, so the statement that we want to be able to test is that, all right, you're a cop, you go into a bar, and you want to test whether anyone's violating the law. And the law says that, well, we can phrase it this way, I'm going to do it, okay. So the law for, what's the drinking age in India? 25? Are you serious? Okay, well, we're going to stick with 21 because I'm going to be confused by this. But, yeah, question. Oh, you want to talk about this one, right? Okay, so that's fine. Okay, so here it's an even card. And we can imagine on the other side, it could be a vowel or it could be a consonant. Okay? Now, the thing is here, the statement is, it's if the card is a vowel, then it has to be even. Right? It doesn't say that if it's a consonant, then it has to be odd. So that's the, right, so it's an if A, then B, and it doesn't mean that, I'm going to get it wrong, if not B, not A. Okay, but, right. Does that make sense? Yeah. It's not wrong, because this, and of course, this is always a question of if we agree about what this logical statement means. Yeah, but what's intended, at least in this logical statement, because if, and it might even be a little bit more clear on the alcohol example. So let's do the alcohol example and see if we agree on that, and then, all right. Okay, so at least in the United States, you have to be 21 plus to drink. Okay? Now the question is, how do we convert this into a logical statement? The logical statement is that if you're drinking alcohol, then you have to be 21 plus. Right? All right, now you're the cop. You go into the bar. Now each individual is going to have a drink and an age. Right? So for each person that's drinking something, you could check their age, or for each person's age, if you know their age, you could ask what they're drinking. Just like the card, the two sides of the card. All right? And you see 4 people in the bar. One person is drinking a beer. Another person is drinking a soda. Another person is 25. And the last person is 17. Okay? It's sort of a family-ish bar, so it's okay to be there in principle, just, you have to watch out what you drink. All right, and the question is for you as your cop, you come up and you say, all right, well, do I need to check these 2 individuals' IDs? Do I need to check what these 2 individuals are drinking? Okay. And in this framework, and it's logically identical to that one. Okay, it's the key statement. Yet, you look at this, and it's obvious. Right? Yeah, you say, well, this guy's having a beer. I should check his ID. This guy's having soda. I don't care how old he is. All right, he's 25. He can drink whatever he wants. I don't care what he's drinking. But here's a 17-year-old. I better check what they're drinking. Okay. So I think that this, to me, I find this example amazing, okay, because I think that this problem really is hard, whereas this problem really is easy. Okay? But they're the same problem, which is hard to believe. Okay, but I think it's highlighting that we are not general purpose calculation devices. Right? We've evolved to solve particular problems. Right? We've evolved to check to see if somebody's stealing something from you or not following some rules, or there's some classes of problems, even though they have the same logical structure as other problems, but in some contexts, they're much, much easier to understand. Okay? So I think that sometimes in the context of biology, we use this intentional language, and partly it's dangerous because it can make, well, there are multiple reasons people don't like the intentional language. Right? One reason is that if you talk about cooperation and defection, we don't want to impose moral judgments on our bacteria. Okay? So that's fine, and I think we can all agree that we should not take the intentional language too seriously there. But there are other dangers. One of them would be that danger that I think is a real danger is that once you give something a name that ties into some of the things that are evolutionarily relevant to us as social animals, then it comes along with a whole set of other things that may or may not be true in the sense of experimentally, if you go and you make measurements, you might assume something's true without going to check it. So I think that's a real danger. Okay. But on the flip side, there's a lot of power associated with tying in problems to the kinds of problems that we're used to dealing with because we're just much better at them. Okay. Questions about this idea? Yeah. Okay, so right, so the question is, let's say that it's not about drinking, it's just already, holding, and if they're holding it, they're probably drinking. Okay, but so let's adjust the law that just say, oh, you're not allowed to hold alcohol unless you're 21. Is that? Ah, I see. For your parents. Yeah, that's totally understandable because your mom is going to the restroom. She asks you to hold your drink, and you're not drinking it. Okay. Okay. So yes, but I guess what I would claim is that now you're bringing like real life things that could be relevant. Okay, and I think that we're still going to be much better at making sense of those and reasoning through them using this kind of reasoning over here on the right than doing something like this. Given that we can't even do the simple things using the abstract logic, I think we can really build on this to incorporate real life complexities, I think, much more effectively, would be my claim. Yes. Okay, exactly. Which is, I think what you're saying is really related to my thing about assumptions, right? That once you use the language, then you assume also. Yeah, I agree. So, and I think this is why, just like I said, that I think it's good to have different kinds of models for the same phenomenon, I would also say that it's good to think about a given set of experiments or data using sometimes different language, because it can be right, because it can really happen that you put on blinders and you just think something has to be true because of the language that you're using. So in general, I would say I'm skeptical. People have these ideas that, like some traditional cultures, if they don't have a word for something, then they can't think it, or that I think I'm skeptical of. But in other cases, I think it is true that the language that we use can have dramatic consequences for the thoughts that come into our minds. So I think it's definitely the case, and this is true regardless of which language we use. So partly, I think, and frankly, sometimes I use cooperation, defection. Sometimes I use producers, non-producers. Sometimes I use, and I think it's good to actually to think through any given set of experiments using different language. Actually. All right. I just want to make sure I know what time. Do we have a clock? 12:20. Okay, great. Perfect. Okay, so what I want to do, Oh, I'm actually not going to do that yet. Sorry, I'll stay on the board. Okay, so I just want to spend a little bit of time thinking about these simple two-player games from game theory because it allows us to tie in with another field in a way that I think is interesting. So these two-player games. All right, we're going to start by just thinking about what they are in the context of game theory, and then we'll discuss how to map them to a population. All right, so what we're going to do is imagine that there are two players, each of which can follow two different strategies. All right, and this is kind of a simple notation that may or may not, well, we'll try to figure out what it means. Okay, so this is telling us about, this is a matrix that tells us the payout to player one, depending upon his strategy, and to player, this is the payout to player one, depending on his strategy, and depending upon the strategy of his opponent. Okay. Right. Now, this is all about player one. But then it's a symmetric game, we're assuming, which means that we could just reorient ourselves and say, okay, well, if player two does these things, then this is if player one does the other. All right, so I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what this means. So this is saying, for example, if player one plays strategy A, player two plays strategy B, then player one gets payout B. And in this case, what it means is that player two is going to get payout C, because what we can do is imagine ourselves instead saying, all right, well, if we were player two playing B, and then player one had played A, then we get to C. We could also, if you prefer the nomenclature, think about writing out both payouts in the sense of this. Here, this is telling us if player one does this, player two does that. This is telling us the payout to player one and the payout to player two. I want to make sure that we're all on the same page on this, though, because I found this can actually cause a lot of problems. All right, so if player... Well, what's worth asking? I'll just reiterate. Player one plays A, player two plays B. This tells us the payout to each of the players, where player one gets this, player two gets that. Okay. All right, but for simplicity, we'll maybe write it out in this format. Okay. All right, so we'll go ahead and write a matrix. Sorry, I hadn't decided exactly which one I wanted to do given the time. Well, all right, so the question here is, what should you do as a player playing this game? Think about it for 30 seconds. All right, we're going to vote. All right, if you want to do strategy A, strategy B, or if it doesn't matter. All right, ready? 3, 2, 1. Right, so here you actually want to do strategy A. Okay? And partly I just want to make sure we are reading this correctly. All right. So one way to think about it is that, okay, if your opponent does A, then you as player 1, you can choose between these two payouts in some sense. Right? 2 is larger than 1, so you would like to play A if your opponent plays A. Okay? Well, what if your opponent played B? Well, here now you have a choice between 3 and 2. And again, 3 is larger than 2, so A is again your best strategy. Okay? So what you get here is that A is actually is here the Nash equilibrium strategy, and it's actually a dominance, right? It's just the best thing to do always. Okay, so this is just A is good. Okay, so now so it's a symmetric game. So this is coming back to reading this thing, which is that if you wanted, we could write out maybe the more complex version, where because these are in some sense these are arbitrary labels is the issue, because it's really whatever player this is from the standpoint of either player. This is saying, okay, this is going to be my payout based on what I do and what the other person does. Yeah, right. So player 2 it really is the same thing, because it's the same matrix from the standpoint of player 2. Because in some ways, this is really just telling me about my payout based on what I do and what my opponent does. But I is just the other player could have the same thought of they are I in that case, and so they're facing the same matrix. So I found that indeed these matrices cause a lot of problems. So and so this matrix we could write out as the following, right? So it's a 2-2. Here it's a 3-1. Here 1-3 and 2-2. Right? So here now we really are specifying player 1 and player 2, where you'd say player 1 here has a choice between the initial side and then I don't know if this helps. Yeah, please. Yeah, maybe. Well, yeah. Yeah, so maybe the whole thing of player 1 and player 2 causes problems. Yeah, and I think that this is maybe the right thing to say. Yeah, because and A and B are strategies rather than the player, but I think that maybe you're right that yes. Did you hear his? Okay. All right. Okay, so let's try a different one while we're. Okay, so we're not going to. Let's not do 1 and 2 then. And so again, you can think of it from your perspective. You can play strategy A or strategy B, and this is going to be your payout depending upon what your opponent does. Oh, all right, let's go ahead and vote. All right, what do you want to do? Do you want to play strategy A or strategy B? Okay. Ready? 3, 2, 1. All right, so I'm learning so much about all of you here. Okay, yeah, so this is the famous prisoner's dilemma game. Is there 2 S's, 2 N's, prisoners? Spelling causes me a lot of problems. Okay, I think it's okay. All right, so here B is the Nash equilibrium. Just like over here, what you saw is that independent of what your opponent did, it was better for you to play strategy A. The same statement is true over here, that independent of what your opponent does, it's better for you to play strategy B. Okay. 4 is larger than 3. 1 is larger than 0. Okay. But the kind of weird thing is that, that this is your reasoning, so you'll play strategy B. Your opponent goes through the same reasoning, so he plays strategy B. Both of you get payout 1. And the important thing to note is that 1 is less than 3. Right, so somehow, if you could have agreed with your opponent to both play strategy A, then you would have both gotten payout 3, which would have been great. The problem, of course, is that 3 is less than 4. All right, so playing A, if both play A, it's a pretty good situation, but it's not a Nash equilibrium, because each player has the incentive to unilaterally change his strategy and play B. Okay. Right, and then if both players do that, then you get out to pay out 1. Okay. So this is highlighting kind of this dilemma of cooperation. How can you somehow stabilize or sustain cooperative strategies in the face of possible defectors? Right? So again, here you could call it A and B, or you could call it cooperation and defection, if you'd like. Now, what we want to do is think about how these sorts of games map onto population dynamics. Okay. Normally, what we do is we just assume that your payout or your growth rate is going to be a result of many of these 2-player interactions. Right? So you as an individual are going to be interacting with all the members of the population. So that means that your growth rate, say, is going to be based on the sum of all of those interactions. All right, so then we can write, all right, the growth rate of an A type in the population. Now we're thinking about, say, a microbial population, right, that is genetically an A type. All right, and well, what is his growth rate or his payout going to be? Well, it depends on the fraction of A and fraction of B in the population. All right, gets a payout A associated with the fraction of A. Remember, and these A's and these 2 A's are not related. Apologies. Plus fraction cap B, little b. Growth rate of the B type in the population. Again, same thing. So what we're assuming is just that we go from a 2-player game to a population by assuming that the fitness of the different types is just based on kind of a sum over many of these 2-player interactions. In particular, when you do that, you get linear payouts or linear growth rates. Right? Now, it's not the case that things in biology are typically linear, okay? But the basic outcomes that you get from this kind of formalism correspond to the basic outcomes that are typically observed experimentally in terms of things like coexistence, bistability, and so forth. right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the payout for gamma A, gamma B, so the growth rates. This is gamma A, and this is gamma B. Okay. And we can go ahead and try to label what each of these points is. Okay, so first, let's try to figure this out. All right, so I'm going to want to write A, B, C, or D onto each of these locations. But I need your help, because I really didn't print out my notes. So, okay, so let's figure this out. Let's start at this point. We're going to figure out whether it's A, B, C, or D. Yes. Yes. Or sorry. Yeah. These are the fractions of A and B in the population. Yeah. Thank you. All right, so on the count of 3, we're all going to yell out what I write here. Okay, ready? 3, 2, 1. Yeah, it's either A or B, okay? Right, because this is the growth rate of the A type, which is this. Okay, now here, what's this point? The fraction of A here is 0. So this guy goes away, fraction B is 1. Yeah, so this one is actually B. Okay? Over here, ready? 3, 2, 1. A. Okay. All right, now let's look over here. Ready? 3, 2, 1. D. And over here is C. Okay. And it's just I want to make sure that we know how to read these things. Okay. Okay. So now what I've done is I've assumed in drawing this some orderings between A, B, C, and D. And the question is, does this lead to what? Does it lead to A winning, B winning, A and B coexisting, or bistability? Okay. This one's bistability. Right? We can see that because above this critical fraction, for high A has a higher growth rate. And so it turns out that based on the relative orderings of A, B, C, and D, these curves can do just a few different things, a few qualitative outcomes. All right? And in particular, you can get either that A wins, B wins, they coexist, or it's bistable. All right, so what we want to do is try to draw what this looks like for the prisoner's dilemma. The question is what this graph is called. I don't know. The growth rates as a function of frequency. No. There might be another name, but yeah. All right, so what we'd like to do is figure out what this looks like for a prisoner's dilemma. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to assume that A is the cooperative type and B is the defecting type. All right, and then we want to try to reconstruct. All right, so what maybe which right, in the prisoner's dilemma, do these two lines cross? We're going to vote. All right. Question is prisoner's dilemma. We're going to try to draw these lines, and everything's always going to be a line here. The question is, do they cross? So it's a yes or a no. So I need help again. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Okay, so we actually have a lot of disagreement about this. All right. One thing that we saw is that in the prisoner's dilemma, which I erased, all right, independent of what your opponent did, it was better for you to defect. That was true on the ends, but since these are lines, that means that they cannot cross, right? Because if everyone's cooperating, it's better for you to be a defector. If everyone's defecting, it's still better for you to be a defector. Since you have lines, then you don't, then they don't cross. Okay, and we just discussed that the defector line should be above the cooperator line. Right? So let's. Oh, and I'm doing. Okay, sorry. This should be a dashed line. Word. All right, so this would be an example of a prisoner's dilemma. This is the growth rate of the cooperator, growth rate of the defector. And again, we can do the same things. This is A, B, D, and C. All right. This is the fraction of the cooperator going from 0 to 1. This is saying that if you're in a population of cooperators, C is greater than A, so the defectors have higher fitness. That'll lead to a decrease in the fraction of cooperators over time. And this is true throughout. One thing that is important in order for this to really be a prisoner's dilemma is that you have to have that here A is greater than D, because you want it to be a cooperative game. Right? You want it to be the case that everyone in the population would be better off if everyone were cooperating, but it's an unstable state from an evolutionary perspective, so then you evolve over here where everybody ends up getting fitness D, because all of the population is a defector down here. So what you can see is that in this situation, you have evolution to lower fitness. Any questions about what's going on here? Right, so one thing that I think is worth saying is that you don't have to use all of this game theory language if you don't want to. And I'm an experimentalist, so everything comes down to what's happening in your system. And here it's too simple. It's linear, but it's not. I would say the way that this could show up experimentally would be the fraction of, say, the producer of some enzyme that's breaking down something, right? And if you look at the fitnesses, it might look something like this. Right? They're not linear, so you can't use the same kind of simple two-player game mechanics. But the key thing is that the defector, well, we're not going to call it that. This is the growth rate of the producer and the growth rate of a non-producer. Okay? The growth rate of the non-producer is higher in a population of producers, so it can invade. And here, if this were the experimental measurement, it could be the case that you get evolution so that the entire population is of the non-producer type, even though the producer would have higher fitness. So if you go and you do the measurement, you have a clonal population of producers in some environment, it might grow up to higher density or grow up faster than the non-producers. But just because the producers on their own have higher fitness than the non-producers on their own does not mean that the non-producers cannot spread. So that's the key statement. Okay. Questions about this? I'll just say quickly at this point, what we see typically experimentally in a bunch of different systems is that it's not unusual for a non-producer to spread in a population of producers, but kind of the typical thing is that these things cross, leading to coexistence. So the more typical situation that we see is something that looks like this, and this leads to coexistence of the two types. So a population of producers can be invaded by a non-producer population. However, it's not, you don't get extinction of the producers. Instead, you get coexistence. All right. Any questions here before we look at some data? Yeah.
This doesn't capture the fact that over time, cooperators will accumulate their payoffs, and overall, you will have a larger score.
You're saying overall, the producers or the cooperators might have a higher score because they accumulate something.
Yeah, so if like playing the game multiple times, the payoff is like 3. So 3, 3, 3, 3.
Yeah, indeed. The way that this would normally work, kind of, if you think about it experimentally, is that there really is just some growth rate at any given time that is a function of the fraction of these things in the population. So then, from that standpoint, it's really just a dynamical system. And if you were to write it, what you would say is the change in the fraction of A with respect to time. Oh my goodness, I'm gonna. I think it looks like. But these things are also functions of the fractions. Right? So I think that, yeah, so this is just, so there's going to be just some differential equation describing how the fractions are going to change over time. Question, yeah?
So are there those relativistic versions of combination? For example, so what we are using here is the differential able to see the growth rate for determining the corresponding population. But I believe in the previous lecture, we were looking at the mutation rates would increase. That is one feature. Correspondingly, the probability of a beneficial mutation, which corresponds somehow to the growth rate, that would increase. So, but the probability is not exactly in terms of.
Yeah, okay, so everything that we're talking about here is kind of in the deterministic limit. And we're also not incorporating any mutation. So of course, what you'd want to do is for a full treatment is think about frequency-dependent selection in the presence of like stochastic effects and mutations, and you'd want to think about ends changing, the population size. Yeah, so it's really, I think, I would say I advocate for kind of various like simplistic models, make sure we understand those, and then start combining them in different ways.
We don't need to explicitly incorporate mutation from one type to another. So that would be a more complete description of the process.
Yes, for sure. And we can add a mutation in here if you want.
But the probabilistic term is more difficult.
Well, okay, so yeah, so you can incorporate mutations in a deterministic kind of framework if you'd like, or you could do a full stochastic treatment. And I like all of them, but yeah, it's just, yeah, but I guess I think it's good to start simple and then build up. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, okay, so here what this is in the limit where we're maintaining constant population size. So then you're imagining that you're sucking off individuals that are that would make the n grow. Although actually even if you just let the n's grow exponentially, this still ends up being what it is, yeah. You can think about getting to this equation in multiple different ways, although, yeah, actually, the derivation, yeah. You don't even have to think about imposing constant n. You just allow, if you just have two populations growing exponentially, so n's are growing, then this is how the fraction evolves. And it's just because it's hard to make fractions go to either 0 or 1 somehow, yeah.
Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
I know you're running out of time. So at the left end, when there are no producers, right? So then you're saying if you put in a few, everything is a non-producer, and you put in a few producers, even then, the growth rate of the non-producers would be smaller, right? I would have thought that producers, so it looks like producers can invade.
Yes, so the producers can invade, and indeed...
So that means they have frequency-dependent selection in this kind of picture?
Yeah, right. And this is what happens kind of generically if the producers have some preferential access to the fruits of their labor, basically. But I would say that, as far as I can tell, that's the typical situation. Even in a bunch of the situations where you'd think that there would not be any preferential access, where it should be as close to being a prisoner's dilemma as you can imagine, often what you see is that the cooperative producer type still has an advantage at low frequency. So I think that there's, I think it's pretty common. Yeah, Mukund. Yeah, right. All right. So the question is, how many types do you have to go to get chaos? Right. And of course, then you have to think about which model you're in. If you're in the constant n model, then that does limit things. Right. So in in the Lotka-Volterra formulation, you can get chaos with 4 species is the minimal, and that means that in the replicator equation formulation, it's one more or one fewer than that. So I want to make sure I always get confused. Okay, sorry. So the Lotka-Volterra of 1 is 2. So I think that this means that you're going to need 5 strategies in the in this to get chaos. Yeah, right. Because with arbitrary first order differential equations, it's possible to do it with 3, right? But the Lotka-Volterra model with species interactions we're going to talk about tomorrow, the final attractor occurs on a manifold that's n-1 dimension. So then, yeah, you need at least 4 species there. And then I think that the mapping, there's a mapping from Lotka-Volterra to this that gives you have to go up to 1 higher. So yeah, I think it's 5 strategies would be required for chaos. But if somebody else has studied this, yeah. Okay, almost all the time you get chaotic dynamics, is what you're saying. Okay, yeah. Right, okay, so, right, this is a big topic. What I can say is that experimentally, if you mix 2 species or 2 strains or strategies, these 4 things of biostability, coexistence, those are the typical things that we see. Now, the question is, as you get to more complex like communities or whatnot, do you generically get chaos? And I would say I have a little, I'm not even convinced that the chaotic dynamics people have seen in the lab are actually chaos. It's very difficult to distinguish deterministic chaos from stochastic dynamics, because in either case you get positive Lyapunov exponents. So it's a big question. Certainly if you look at natural populations, there's a lot of fluctuations, but that could have many different causes. So I would say I'm agnostic about it. Yeah. All right, so we have 5 minutes. Is that kind of where we are? Or 2? Okay. All right. I think maybe I'm going to just draw some things on the board because it's maybe not worth. Well, that's not true. All right. I want to show you some data. So can we go ahead and put it up? All right, so I was going to tell you guys about rock, paper, scissors dynamics in male mating strategies in lizards, but you'll have to, if you guys are curious, you can ask me later. Right, so we were talking about this thing of when you get coexistence, and we often do see that experimentally between these sorts of producer, non-producer types. I don't know if. And so one thing that we've seen in a lot of our experiments is that it's often valuable or exciting or interesting to look at changes in population size as well as changes in fractions. Right. So everything that we've been talking about is just thinking about fractions, but I want to show you some data that highlights that changes in population size are also important. Okay. All right, so here, this is kind of what you might think of as the dynamics between the cooperator and the cheater. Right. What we talked about yesterday was a case where we had a population of yeast that were all collectively growing on the sugar sucrose, and that led to the tipping points, bifurcations, and all that stuff. But we can also use this system to think about what happens if one of the types stops producing this public good. Okay, so this would correspond to a cheater. In this case, we can actually make this such a strain just by going in and removing the gene required for this cooperative behavior. So in this case, just pulling out the gene that encodes the enzyme invertase that breaks down the sugar. All right, so in that case, this cheater strain, it still is getting the benefits associated with the cooperative behaviors from the other cells in the population, but it's not contributing to that public good. Right? So it's not paying the metabolic cost associated with making that enzyme, which we measure to be about 2%. Right, so making this enzyme to break down the sugar costs the cell about 2% in terms of slows down the division rate of the cell. Right, so the question then is, well, in the context of these games, does it correspond to one of these kind of prisoner's dilemmas where maybe the cheater has an advantage relative to the cooperator at all relative frequencies? And that would suggest that at least in a well-mixed environment, you wouldn't have cooperators at equilibrium. Okay? However, what we see in this system and a variety of others is that if you actually go and you compete the cooperators against those cheaters or the defectors, what you see is that indeed the state of full cooperation is not stable against invasion by the cheater, so the cooperative fraction decreases. And as that occurs, we do see a decrease in the growth rate of the population, like what we were talking about before. Okay? However, here and in others, what we see is that if you start with a low fraction of cooperators, here 1%, and then you look to see what happens over time, what you see is now the cooperator fraction is increasing. Okay? So what's happening is that it's mutually invasible, like what we were talking about before. Okay? And you can measure, there's an equilibrium fraction. That equilibrium fraction depends upon the environment. It depends on the sugar concentrations and other things. So there's nothing magical about here, 16%. It's really just that depending on the environment, you get a different fraction at coexistence, but you do get coexistence between the types. Okay? All right, I'm going to skip that. Yeah, and basically what's happening here is what I was hitting at before, is that there's preferential access. So the cooperators, they make that enzyme, they secrete it out, but some of the enzyme gets stuck in the cell wall. Right? And so what that means is that at the end of the day, some of the sugar that is broken down close to the cooperator. So the cooperator has this preferential access. Right? We see this here as well as a bunch of other systems. Okay? And I do want to just switch over to show what happens if you track the dynamics of the fractions and the numbers. Over time. Yeah. Well, sorry. I just want to zoom in. Okay. So this is so in all of this evolutionary game theory literature, the replicator equation, and all of it, there's a huge amount of work there, and I like it, obviously. But from the very beginning, the assumption is that it's just changes in fraction that matter. Right? So changes in population size are irrelevant. Okay? However, what we see is that there's often coupling between changes in frequencies and changes in density or population size. Okay? And I just wanted to show this because this is experimental data where we're just growing our yeast in daily batch culture like normal, and each line segment corresponds to our experimentally measured fraction and population size. So what you can see is that, well, fractions are changing, but also population size is changing, and they're coupled. Right? So this is an example of an eco-evolutionary kind of feedback loop. Right? What you can see is that if you start with a low cooperator fraction, then the population size shrinks because there isn't very much food. But as the population size shrinks, now the preferential access that the cooperators have to the fruits of their labor is really important, so the cooperators spread in the population. But as they spread, they're now breaking down more food that allows the population size to grow. So you kind of come up here. Okay, out here, though, this is where the cheaters have an advantage because there's a lot of cells, a lot of cooperators, a lot of food, so the cheaters can spread, cooperative fraction goes down. So what we see experimentally are these kind of spirals to a state of equilibrium. Okay. And it's I think just high, and we see a lot of cases where the size or the density of the population is really important. Okay? The situations where you have frequency dependence are also the situations where you tend density dependence. And I think that this is actually a significant kind of oversight in the field of just assuming from the get-go that densities are kind of, that we can just not think about densities. And then finally, I'll just mention, from yesterday we talked about how the eigenvalue goes to 0. There's critical slowing down. All right, the question is, how does that show up here? Well, you might reasonably, the expectation from theory, and that we could confirm experimentally, is that it's now the real part of the eigenvalue that goes to 0, because these are complex eigenvalues, because they're spiraling. And the statement is that as the real part of the eigenvalue goes to 0, the spirals become more spirally. Okay? So I'm just going to show you what that looks like in simulation, so you know what I mean by spirally. Because this is data. Next slide. Okay, this is just from a simple model. The expectation is that as you go close to a point of collapse, you see how the spirals are kind of spiraling around more as they go. In the model, at least, you have a Hopf bifurcation that leads to extinction of the population. Okay? So somebody asked about Hopf bifurcations yesterday. But we're out of time, so I'll quit. I just wanted to show you some of these spirals, because tomorrow we're going to talk about interspecies interactions, or they could be viewed as interstrain interactions, where population sizes are going to be kind of the object of study. And I think that maintaining a focus on population size in addition to fractions is really important.